In this session, we will look at some other various finds that confirm the details surrounding the Gospels. John records that very large stone jars were involved when Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana. In this clip, we will see the archaeological evidence for those jars.
About the wedding at Cana in Galilee. And it's describing the pouring of water out of 6 large stone jars, which turned into wine. Everybody paid attention to this miracle of water into wine. I paid attention to the jars.
Of course, yes.
This passage in John gives me the opportunity to say today what these big stone jars that we find in large numbers in Jerusalem, particularly in Jerusalem, but also in Galilee, what were they used for? They were used to hold water in the house.
The Gospels record that Jesus did mighty works in Chorazin and rebuked them because they did not repent. In our next clip, we will see the evidence for the existence of this unrepentant city.
So I'm here at Chorazin, above the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, where Bethsaida is and the other northern towns where Peter came from, and Andrew, the sons of Zebedee. And this is actually the synagogue here at Chorazin that was added to in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. But many of the pieces that we find in here are actually from the 1st century AD also. A synagogue that Jesus would have actually taught in. And it's remarkable here when you read, especially in the book of Matthew, how Jesus, when he would sit in the Moses seat, and he would say, these other teachers of the law that sit in this seat, they'll declare to you all of these rules and all of these rituals, and yet they don't practice what they preach. Woe to them. And then he actually came back here to Chorazin, and he said, woe to you, woe to this entire city, for I performed miracles here, I taught here, I reached out to the people here, and yet you still rejected me. So here we are in Chorazin, where Jesus came back and he said ultimately, woe to you. Because if in Tyre and Sidon they saw the miracles that I performed here, they would have repented in dust and ashes.
Matthew writes that Jesus taught in the synagogues all around Galilee, and this would have included the town of Migdal. In this next video, we will see the archaeological evidence for a 1st century synagogue in Migdal.
The synagogue is located under the heights of Mount Arbel, north of Tiberias and on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The synagogue also sat at the edge of the ancient city of Migdal, once a thriving community of 30,000 and home to Mary Magdalene. Workers are still digging at the synagogue. They carefully sift through the dirt to find any important relics from 2,000 years ago. They hope to uncover more of what some believe is one of the most significant archaeological finds in recent history. Dina Avshalom Gorny leads the excavation. When she discovered the synagogue, she knew it was special.
I thought to myself, Dina, what? Are you telling me that you are standing in a synagogue of the 1st century AD? I can't believe it.
After years of excavation in the region, this is the first synagogue discovered in the Galilee from the 1st century. Gorny says it's miraculous that it lay just below the surface for 2,000 years.
Just look how close to the surface we are, a few centimeters. And it stays like this 2,000 years, waiting for us to excavate it, to find it, to put it again to the air, so that everybody all over the world can see it. But nothing touched the synagogue itself. So I think it's a kind of a miracle. This is an archaeologist's miracles.
Archaeologist Stephen Fahn is the founder of the University of the Holy Land.
This is a synagogue where we know that the place was destroyed and not built upon after the 1st century. So it goes back to the time of Jesus and his disciples.
The unique part of the synagogue is this stone base. On the side of the base is a carving of a menorah. Archaeologists believe the artist copied the menorah from the one he saw in the temple in Jerusalem. The menorah carving marks the first one ever found outside Jerusalem from the 1st century. It's also the first menorah portrayed as a Jewish symbol. Gorny says the stone base itself played a key role in the synagogue.
We believe that it was a base of a prayer table. If you look carefully at the stone, you can see that they had 4 kind of columns made of stone, and we believe that on top of it were a kind of a shelf or a piece of a table. Who stand next to it put his scrolls or paper on top of it and prayer or say his words to the community.
Gorney says given the age of the synagogue, its location, and the history of the Galilee, it's likely Jesus taught there.
We can say that Jesus was standing as a rabbi of the community, was standing here next to this prayer table and in prayer and say his words to his community, and no doubt.
In the meantime, workers will continue to categorize and record their finds. Gorney expects the synagogue to be open to the public in a few years, when the world can see the place where Jesus might have led his disciples. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Migdal.
The Gospels also record that Jesus was taken before Caiaphas, the high priest, when he was arrested. In this next video, we will see evidence for Caiaphas.
These ossuary on display at the Israel Museum were used to hold the bones of the deceased. The director of the museum talks about one very special ossuary, bearing the name of the high priest, Caiaphas.
The box you're looking at this moment is not a jewelry box. It is a box made out of limestone, the local stone. And during the period of the Second Temple, the bones of the dead were deposed in such boxes. And therefore it's called an ossuary. In Latin, os means bone. And such boxes, after the bones were deposited in them, usually were then put into caves in a protected area where sometimes whole families kept together the bones of their family. We have maybe hundreds of thousands of boxes like this, ossuaries, that were found in the country. But this ossuary is so special because it has an inscription which mentions the bones, the name of the bones of the person that was buried in the box. And the name that is mentioned in here is Josephus Caiaphas. And the family of Caiaphas is well known to us from several sources. The first source being the Talmud. We know about the family that they were high priests in the temple. They were not often liked at the period. But it was apparently a very aristocratic family belonging to the group of Jews who were called the Sadducees. And the second case we know the name from is from the New Testament.
Luke explains that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea, and the Gospels record that he presided over the trial of Jesus. Let's take a look at the solid archaeological evidence for Pontius Pilate.
So here on the point where Herod's palace is, we find an inscription. And this inscription was actually a dedication stone that says, Pontius Pilatus, the prefect of Judea, erected a building dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. Now this is actually a replica. The original is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But this gives more credence, more compelling evidence for Pontius Pilate at the time of Jesus Christ.
The New Testament records that a man named Simon of Cyrene was compelled to bear the cross of Jesus for some part of the trip to Golgotha. In this next video, we will learn about evidence for Simon the Cyrene.
But in addition to Pontius Pilate, there's archaeological evidence of other people involved in the Passion of Jesus, like Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus. Claire Fawn is an expert in early Christianity.
Both Simon of Cyrene, the father of Rufus and Alexander according to the Gospel of Mark, and Caiaphas, who was high priest at the time of Jesus and who oversaw his Jewish trial, are both independently attested by the discovery of each of their bone boxes or ossuaries. Now it's very interesting to think that when you're looking at this event that happened on one weekend in Jerusalem, nearly 2,000 years ago, that 3 of the people who played significant roles in that and who are recorded in the documentary evidence are also attested to archaeologically.
The Gospels record that Jesus was put to death through crucifixion, and later Jesus showed his disciples the wounds in his hands and feet. In this next video, we will learn how archaeology has proven this barbaric practice was common in the time of Jesus Christ.
Joe, I understand you've been studying the field of crucifixion for a long time. Can you tell me how rare was crucifixion as a means of execution in ancient times?
Well, actually, it was very common. We know that they did it for perhaps 800 years. They did it throughout Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, Great Britain. I think the question is not who did it, the question is there anybody who didn't do it? And we know that the figures probably run, I would say perhaps even maybe over 100,000.
100,000 people, perhaps?
During a period of 800 years. We know, for example, on one day in Rome, they crucified 6,000 people in one day. It gives you an idea of how fast they could do it and how efficient they could do it.
Well, we know the Romans used it extensively. Did other cultures use it as well?
Everybody used it, though there were exceptions. Like, for example, with the Jews crucified under very, very well-defined circumstances. And that was for going over to the enemy, for people who were traitors. You were killed first by stoning, and then after you were dead, you then were hung from a tree.
Why would you hang someone after they had been killed?
You have to realize that back in those days, people lived in communities where everybody knew each other. And this was to go and humiliate the family, the individual, the people who were involved in this.
It wasn't to execute them, they'd already been executed, but to humiliate them.
They were dead and then hung from a tree.
How actually did death occur when a person was crucified?
This is something which is, until lately, very, very, I think, misunderstood. We know that, for example, if I were to take a young man, and if I were to handcuff him and hang him from a beam by his hands, he's dead within an hour of asphyxiation. If you hold his feet down so he can't pull himself up and down, he's dead within 6 to 10 minutes.
So it makes a lot of difference if the hands are up above the head.
Exactly. On the other hand, if the hands are extended in this fashion here, you have no problems breathing whatsoever. There were experiments done in New York. College students volunteered to go on a cross with seat belts. Their whole physiological response was monitored. And
people actually volunteered to be crucified temporarily then.
There were students up there for 45 minutes, which had no problems whatsoever with breathing. So all the theories about breathing difficulties are correct only if your hands are above your head. If your hands are outspread, the body goes into what's called hypovolemic shock. It's one of the types of shock. And you eventually, what happens is the system metabolically, physiologically shuts down, and then you eventually die. Now, I can keep you up there for hours, days. We know, for example, of a case in Bethlehem where there were 3 friends of Josephus who were being crucified in Bethlehem, been on a cross for, I think, 2 days. And he went to the authorities, and they said, take him down. He went there and took him down, and 1 or 2 of them lived happily ever after. So it depends upon really the sadistic ingenuity of the executioner. You can make it fast, you make it slow.
So in this kind of shock, what happens to the systems of the body?
Yeah, what happens is that metabolically these things and physiologically these things start to shut down, okay? And the whole physiological process, the breathing, the blood circulation, and so on and so forth. Now what's interesting about this is if you remove those circumstances which are causing you to go into hypovolemic shock, you can revive the person. Today we know clinically in about 75% of the cases, which is the reason why Josephus could go to Bethlehem, remove these individuals, and 1 or maybe 2 of them survived. The other thing is, I think this points out the fact that in Judaism, one was required to go to the grave of the deceased 3 days after the person died. The reason is that trying to clinically define death, even today, for the inexperienced person is very difficult. And so back in antiquity, according to Judaic law, 3 days after you were dead, somebody went to the tomb.
So they had to verify
They had to verify it, and we even know of a case, for example, where the Jews went to the tomb and the guy was not dead. He had gone into some type of a coma, and evidently it was because of that the Jews realized that halachically you had to visit the tomb 3 days after the death.
The importance of the third day is emphasized in Matthew 27, which states that the chief priests and Pharisees asked Pilate to command, therefore, that the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead. Jesus had addressed the significance of the third day when he told his disciples that the Son of Man would be delivered to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him, and the third day he shall rise again.
And we understand that often during crucifixion, the legs of the victim would be broken. What was the purpose of that?
One of the things which they would do to prolong it is that they would take a piece of wood about this wide, about this long. They would put it underneath the buttocks. And what happened is the individuals would use their arms and their legs to push themselves up on the cross. And you can sit there for maybe a minute or two. You can inhale, exhale. But what happens, eventually you're going to slip. And what happens is that once you slip down, the process then starts all over again. So to make death much quicker, what you do is you break the legs, and they then cannot use the legs to pull themselves up on this little, it's called a sedicule. So what it does is, again, in terms of the body going into shock, it's going to hasten death.
So that was a means of hastening
it, yeah.
death.
And again, you have to realize, yeah, you know, there may be hundreds of people waiting in line. Like, for example, the case in Rome where you get 6,000 people. You got to do it fast, and you know, you can't be waiting the rest of your life. So these were ways, I think, in which the Roman soldiers, it was always a three-man execution team. It was just ways of speeding up the process.
On the day of Jesus' crucifixion, the Roman soldiers broke the legs of the two thieves in order to assure their death before the oncoming Sabbath. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already, they brake not his legs, but one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him shall not be broken. And again another scripture saith, they shall look upon him whom they've pierced.
Joe, I understand you've made a very rare find of an example of a crucified person. When was this found, and what were the circumstances around its finding?
Okay. In 1968, a colleague of mine was digging here in Jerusalem. It was one of these accidental finds. And here were a series of ossuaries in a Jewish tomb going back to the time of Christ. And in one of the ossuaries, they found a heel bone. This is what's called the calcaneum of an individual. And what's unique about this, if you look very clearly, you can see this is an individual which had a nail which was driven laterally through a piece of wood. We can still see traces of olive wood here after 2,000 years. It then went laterally into the heel. And then what happened?
Now that's a...
This is the right heel.
The right heel of a human foot.
Yeah.
With a nail through the middle of it. And there's evidence of a piece of wood
here
on the outside.
Okay, yeah, let me go and explain it to you perhaps in a different way, and maybe it'll make it much clearer. We have a nail here. This is about 11.5 centimeters long. This was more or less the length of that nail.
That's typical of a Roman nail.
It's a typical nail.
Squared shape. Sure. Of the nail body itself.
Correct.
Okay.
What they did was that they drove this through a piece of olive wood. It then functions as a washer. Now that you have it through the piece of wood, they then would take the heel of the individual. It then penetrated the heel, going in from the outside. And in this case here, what seems to be occurring, they then nailed him to the tree. But what happened, again, left foot over here, right foot over here. What happened, it seems that when this went into the tree, the nail bent and it fish hooked.
May have hit an obstruction of some kind.
Exactly.
Or a knot.
Perhaps a knot in the wood or something hard in the wood. When it fish hooked, it then became impossible to remove it. So that's the reason. If you look at this here, what you're seeing here, you see how the thing is bent over here. And this simply makes it impossible to remove. So they buried this individual with a nail in his foot.
Normally, I suppose, the nail was removed, if it could be, in many cases.
You have to realize that what you're looking at here, you're looking at the only case in the world. There is no other case whatsoever where we have direct physical evidence of crucifixion. The reasons, I think, are two. One thing is that most people probably were tied to crosses. If you look at the good thief and the bad thief, they're always tied. Jesus is the only one that's nailed.
So nailing was not always common.
I think it may have been the exception. I think it may have been the exception to the rule. First of all, just in terms of ecology, in terms of having to continually recycle the cross, if you're continually nailing it, after a few crucifixions, you have to make another cross. If you tie them up there, again, there's no relationship whatsoever between being nailed or tied. The body's going to go into shock.
Same thing happens.
Same thing happens. The other thing is, we know from Jewish sources that there was probably a brisk trade going on in nails of people who had been crucified.
Why would somebody want a nail from somebody who'd been crucified?
According to the Jewish sources, according to the Mishnah, there were 3 things that a Jew could carry in his pocket on Shabbat. You know that on Shabbat, Jews were not allowed to carry anything in their pockets. No money. But there were 3 exceptions. One was the tooth of a jackal, the other was an egg from a lizard, and a third thing was a nail of a man who had been crucified. Evidently, these things were such powerful amulets that these were in that category of exceptions, which you could carry on Shabbat. They were that powerful. So the evidence seemed to suggest there was probably a brisk trade going of men who had been crucified, the nails.
So there was a religious reason for wanting a nail from a crucified person.
I wouldn't say religious. I would say a superstitious reason is what it was. It was superstitious.
And that's why you wouldn't find many bones with nails in them from the crucified people. It was a rare thing. But they couldn't remove this nail.
Because it was bent.
Because it was bent. And so it has become one of the rare finds that has been made. How does all of this, Joe, relate to the most important crucifixion that we know of, the crucifixion of Jesus?
This is a question which we're frequently asked, and I would say that it probably impacts very little. The reason is, if you look at the New Testament, it says Jesus was crucified, end of sentence. It doesn't say how, it doesn't say 3 nails, 4 nails. The whole question of nailing of the feet is something which is very, very questionable. It simply says he was crucified. I think what it does, it forces us to go and realize that many people were crucified. It was a very cruel form of punishment. It wasn't just something which was just for Jesus and Christians. Everybody did it for a very, very, very long time. So these are the type of questions, I think, which one asks. The other thing is, which is very clear, it forces us to go and ask questions about all those pictures we've been looking at for over 1,000 years. One thing which is clear, when you're looking at crucifixion scenes, with the exception of very, very few, and I've been looking at this for years, when you're looking at crucifixion scenes, you're looking at theology. You're not looking at history. A case in point. It's impossible to crucify a person through the hands.
Through the palms of the hands.
Through the palm of the hands.
That's where we normally see it in the pictures.
That's where you always, with 1 or 2 exceptions. We've known since the 1940s, a French doctor he was a surgeon, he took arms of people who had been amputated, fixed them to a cross, put weights. He found out that more than 80 pounds, if the nail's here, the body can't be supported.
What happens?
It just rips out, because there's nothing here. You have to realize that from this point on, what you have here is nothing but flesh and muscle.
So it just pulls out.
It just pulls out. That's all it is. If they did nail, and we've known this now for about 400 or 500 years, we didn't have to wait until this French doctor told us in the 1940s. We've known since, I think, the 16th century, that a nail has to go through the wrist. Italian artists were putting cadavers on crosses for artistic realism. And they realized in the 16th century, if the nail doesn't go through here, the body can't be supported. So rule number 1, if they are using nails, it has to go right in here.
What happens when it's in the wrist there? What keeps it from coming out?
Okay, what you have here, you have 2 bones here. You have what's called the ulna and the radius. and the nail goes between the ulna and the radius. And then you have the small bones here in the hand, which are fully articulated, and this is what you're suspended from.
And that would hold the weight of the body.
That will hold, it will hold someone like you, will hold someone like me.
The Gospels record that the tomb had a large stone in front that was rolled before the door to seal off the entrance. In this next video, we will see a tomb from the same period that has a large stone as the New Testament described.
Shalom, Russ here again with another episode of Touring Israel 3 minutes at a time. What you're looking at here is a tomb located in a park behind the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Now sometime you'll have to ask me, because I've got a funny story to tell about finding this tomb. If in fact this is really Herod's family tomb is debatable. Now we know it's not Herod's tomb because Herod, according to Josephus, was buried in the Herodian, and that tomb has been recently found. One source I read says that the sarcophagus of Mariamne, one of Herod's many wives, was actually removed from this tomb. The British removed it during World War II when they used this tomb as an air raid shelter. One of the things I do know is that one of Israel's leading archaeologists, Gabriel Barkay, in a lecture said that this was only one of 4 or 5 rolling stone tombs left in Jerusalem today. In some of these pictures I'm showing you, you can see that stone close up. One of the things that makes this tomb so fascinating for Christians today is that it is a real 1st century tomb. The tomb of Jesus could have looked very much like this. Just imagine it. We can read about this tomb in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, beginning with verse 57. Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded that the body be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled the large stone against the door of the tomb and departed. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the tomb.
The disciples openly claimed to write the New Testament from the perspective of eyewitnesses. In our next video, we will see what some archaeologists have to say about the historical accuracy of the New Testament.
We spoke about the historical accuracy of these books with respected Jewish archaeologist Dr. Gabriel Barkay, who recently was awarded the prize for archaeology in Israel. As an archaeologist, do you think that the writers of the New Testament anchored their stories in real historical events, real historical things that you've discovered in the past?
Yes, I do. I think that much of the evidence of the Gospels mirrors a reality of 1st century of the Common Era.
Dr. Megan Broshy is former curator of the Shrine of the Book, Israel's museum containing the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is a world-renowned archaeologist and scholar, having excavated the most recent discoveries of caves at Qumran.
I mean, the setting is absolutely accurate, the geography is accurate, the mode of living. I mean, they couldn't have invented it, and they didn't have a need to invent anything.
We can actually go to the place. It's a real place. It isn't some fairy tale land somewhere. It isn't King Arthur and his round table. We can actually go someplace and say, this is where it all happened. In fact, look, we've actually dug up the very pavement where he walked, and, you know, things like that can be found.
Respected Jewish archaeologist Dr. Hillel Giva has worked on some of the most important archaeological excavations in Jerusalem since 1967. He is the editor of the leading Hebrew journal on biblical archaeology in Israel.
The New Testament is a very authentic historical book. I mean, no doubt that there is history in it, real history and authentic history in the book.
So this is, as I say, a time when there was still quite a number of eyewitnesses, of people that knew about the events firsthand. And there is absolutely no fiction there. They are not historical novellas. They are as far as accurate as they could have done.
In fact, archaeologists have confirmed that Luke was so accurate that he cited facts about 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands, several rulers, and he never made one mistake.
So far, we have seen the early details recorded in the Gospels are resoundingly confirmed by archaeology.